In the vast and often grim history of humanity, few things have inspired as much terror as medieval dungeons. These dark, damp, God-forsaken pits were far more than mere cells. They were the epitome of human suffering, places where hope went to die and the concept of justice twisted into a cruel grimace. Among all the prisons that have existed, from makeshift castle dungeons to modern jails with their steel bars, one stands as a monument to horror: the Oubliette. Its name, derived from the French oublier, to forget, is no poetic metaphor. It was, quite literally, a place where prisoners were thrown to be forgotten. If there ever was a place where one would prefer to face a hungover executioner's axe rather than spend a single night, it was this. Brace yourself, because we're about to descend into the depths of the worst prison in history, a place so dreadful that even the most hardened criminals begged for death rather than cross its threshold. Imagine, if you can, medieval Europe, a world of towering castles, knights in armor that gleamed under the sun, when it wasn't rusted, and villagers living on the edge of starvation while feudal lords bickered over who had the divine right to trample whom. In this context, justice was hardly a polished system. Steal a loaf of bread, and you could lose a hand. Offend the wrong noble, and well, let's just say your life expectancy took a nosedive. But even in this landscape of everyday brutality, the Oubliette stood out as a masterpiece of architectural sadism. It wasn't just a prison, it was a statement of intent. Here we don't just punish you, we erase you from existence. The Oubliette was no ordinary prison, with orderly cells and guards who, at the very least, tossed you a moldy crust of bread now and then. No, this was a pit, literally. Built deep within the bowels of a castle, often carved directly into the rock, the Oubliette was a deep, narrow, inescapable hole, accessible only through a trapdoor in the ceiling. Picture a well, but instead of water, it's filled with despair, rats, and the echoes of the screams of those who came before you. The trapdoor, by the way, wasn't for convenient comings and goings. It was one way. Once you were thrown through it, there was no going back. No stairs, no ropes, no kind guards to hoist you up for a quick trial. The idea was simple. They dropped you in, shut the trapdoor, and well, there you stayed until time, hunger, or madness took care of you. The Oubliette's design was an exercise in minimalist cruelty. There were no windows. Why would you need light if your fate was to be forgotten? Ventilation was a luxury not even considered. The air, if you could call it that, was a stale mix of dampness, mold, and the stench of slowly decomposing bodies. The temperature varied by castle, but generally, it was a bone-chilling cold, as if winter itself had decided to move in with you at the bottom of the pit. And speaking of the bottom, the floor was hardly a welcoming place. It was often covered in mud, excrement, and the remains of previous prisoners, because nobody bothered to clean. Why would they? The Oubliette wasn't a hotel with housekeeping. It was a human black hole. You might think that in a world where life was already pretty miserable, prisoners would be used to a bit of discomfort. But the Oubliette took suffering to another level. Prisoners weren't just locked away. They were stripped of all humanity. There was no contact with the outside world. No visits, no letters, not even the chance to hurl insults at a guard. The isolation was absolute. In a regular prison, you might at least hear the clank of other prisoners' chains or the echo of footsteps in the corridor, something to remind you that you were still in the world of the living. In the Oubliette, the silence was so oppressive that many swore they could hear their own thoughts unraveling into madness. And then there were the rats. Not the cute, animated rats of children's movies, but ravenous creatures, some as big as small cats, who saw prisoners as a walking buffet. These rats didn't just nibble on whatever food there might be, if any. They feasted on toes, clothing, or anything that vaguely smelled of flesh. Prisoners, weakened by hunger and disease, could barely fend them off. Some tried to negotiate with the rats, offering imaginary crumbs, but medieval rats weren't known for their conversational skills. They were, let's say, undiscriminating food critics. Speaking of food, the issue of sustenance in the Oubliette was a cruel joke. At best, guards might toss a crust of bread or a bucket of murky water through the trapdoor every few days, but this was no guarantee. Often, prisoners relied on whatever they could catch. Think rats, insects, or, in extreme cases, things I'd rather not mention. Hunger was a constant, a daily reminder that your body was consuming itself. And if hunger didn't kill you, thirst did. The water, when it came, was usually contaminated, because the guards weren't exactly sommeliers concerned with quality service. But the true horror of the oubliette wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Absolute darkness has a way of creeping into your mind, making you question whether you're still human or have become part of the mold growing on the walls. Prisoners reported hallucinations, faces in the shadows, voices whispering their names from nowhere. Some believed they were cursed, that the devil himself had designed the oubliette as a rehearsal for hell. Others simply lost the ability to distinguish between sleep and wakefulness, trapped in an endless cycle of nightmares. The loneliness was a weapon as sharp as any sword. Many prisoners preferred talking to the rats over facing the void of their own thoughts. So, who ended up in such a place? Not always the worst criminals, though murderers and traitors could certainly find themselves there. In medieval Europe, justice was more a whim of the powerful than a system. Offend the local lord, question the church, or simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you could find yourself plummeting through that trapdoor. Oubliettes were especially popular for political prisoners, those who posed a threat to the status quo but whose public execution might cause trouble. It was easier, and more discreet, to simply let them vanish. Nobody asked questions when someone was thrown into oblivion. After all, who would miss a heretic, a rebel, or a peasant who didn't pay their taxes? One of the most infamous oubliettes was found in the Château de Pierrefonds in France. This castle, with its towering spires and fairy tale exterior, at least from the outside, housed a pit that was the stuff of nightmares. Historical records are scarce, because, well, the point of the oubliette was to leave no trace, but oral histories speak of prisoners thrown into the pit for crimes as trivial as giving a noble a dirty look. One chronicle tells the story of a man named Guillaume, locked away for stealing a horse, or perhaps refusing to give up his horse. The sources are unclear. Guillaume spent weeks in the oubliette, surviving on moss and water dripping from the walls. When he was finally rescued, because a new lord decided to clean out the castle, he was so emaciated he looked more like a skeleton than a man. According to legend, when asked how he survived, he simply replied, "I didn't." Another castle notorious for its oubliette was Chillon, in Switzerland, perched on the shores of Lake Geneva. This place, which today looks like it belongs on a postcard, was in its time a symbol of terror. Chillon's oubliette was particularly cruel because it was carved into the rock at lake level, meaning water constantly seeped in, keeping the floor in a perpetual state of icy mud. Prisoners didn't just contend with darkness and hunger, but also a constant, bone-chilling cold. One of Chillon's most famous prisoners was François Bonnivard, a cleric and patriot who inspired Lord Byron's poem, The Prisoner of Chillon. Though Bonnivard wasn't exactly in an oubliette, his conditions were, let's say, luxurious by comparison. Descriptions of the castle's dungeons paint a grim picture, a place where time stood still and death was a release. But don't think the oubliette was exclusive to France or Switzerland. These pits of hell were scattered across Europe, from England to Italy. In Warwick Castle, England, the oubliette was known as the Pit of the Damned, a name that left little to the imagination. Prisoners were thrown into a hole so narrow they could barely move, with walls so smooth that climbing was impossible. The guards, in a touch of dark humor, would sometimes toss chicken bones or food scraps, not to feed the prisoners, but to attract the rats. Because, of course, what's an oubliette without some furry company? In Italy, the castle of San Leo, perched on a hill in Emilia-Romagna, had its own version of the oubliette, known as the Cella del Pozzetto, the cell of the little well. This place was particularly infamous because, besides being a narrow, dark pit, it was designed so prisoners couldn't sit or lie down comfortably. The cell was so small that prisoners had to stand or crouch, causing constant physical agony. One of San Leo's most famous prisoners was Count Alessandro Cagliostro, an 18th-century alchemist and charlatan who, according to Chronicles, spent his final days in this cell. Though Cagliostro was a man of wit and charisma, even he succumbed to the despair of the Oubliette, and stories say his screams echoed through the castle at night, to the terror of the guards. In Scotland, Hermitage Castle, on the border with England, had an oubliette that was the nightmare of traitors and prisoners of war. This castle, with its grim appearance and isolated location, was the perfect setting for a pit of oblivion. Prisoners, often captured during the wars between Scots and English, were thrown into a hole carved into the rock, where the Scottish winter's cold made the suffering even more unbearable. One story tells of an English knight, captured during a raid, who was thrown into Hermitage's oubliette and managed to survive for weeks by eating moss and catching water droplets with his mouth. When he was finally released as part of a prisoner exchange, he was so weakened that he died days later, but not before cursing his captors with a vehemence that impressed even the rugged Scots. The question you're probably asking is, why would anyone design something so horrific? The answer lies in the medieval mindset. In an era where life was cheap and death lurked around every corner, thanks to plague, wars, and a general lack of hygiene, punishment had to be spectacular to make an impression. The oubliette wasn't just a punishment, it was a warning. It said, "This is what happens to those who defy the established order." It was a tool of control, a way to keep the population in line without the need for a public trial or execution that might turn a criminal into a martyr. Plus, it was cheap. Building an oubliette required little more than a pickaxe, a shovel, and a complete lack of empathy. Yet, not all prisoners surrendered to the fate imposed by the oubliette. There are stories, few, but fascinating, of escape attempts. Some prisoners, driven by desperation or near-heroic optimism, tried to climb the walls, using any crack or ledge for support. Most failed, falling back to the bottom, often with broken bones that only prolonged their agony. Others tried to communicate with the outside world, screaming until their throats tore, hoping some compassionate or bribable guard might hear them. In rare cases, some survived long enough for a change of regime or a stroke of luck to free them. But these stories are the exception. The rule was that the oubliette was a slow death sentence, wrapped in darkness. One of the most legendary escape attempts occurred at the Castle of Lox, in France. According to tradition, a prisoner, whose name is lost to history, managed to carve small notches into the rock using a bone he found at the bottom of the pit. 4 months, perhaps years, he worked patiently, using the notches as footholds to climb toward the trapdoor. The story says he reached the trapdoor but found it locked with a padlock. Exhausted and defeated, he fell back to the bottom, where he died soon after. The story is likely apocryphal, but it illustrates the level of desperation that drove prisoners to attempt the impossible. The cultural impact of the oubliette wasn't limited to the Middle Ages. Even today, the idea of a place where one is forgotten resonates in our imagination. Movies, books, and video games have drawn inspiration from these dungeons, though they often romanticize them, adding flickering torches and heroes who escape with Hollywood-worthy ingenuity. The reality was far less glamorous. There were no conveniently placed ropes or bumbling guards dropping keys. The oubliette was the antithesis of heroism. It was the place where heroes, villains, and the unfortunate faded into nothingness. If we try to quantify the horror of the oubliette, we run into a problem. Historical records are scarce. Feudal lords weren't exactly keen on keeping diaries of who they threw into their pits. The few documents that survive are vague, mentioning prisoners sent to the dungeon, without going into detail. But oral chronicles, legends, and travelers' accounts paint a consistent picture. The oubliette was a place that broke not just the body, but the soul. The few prisoners who survived often emerged as empty shells, unable to reintegrate into society. Some went mad, others refused to speak, and the luckiest simply died shortly after release, as if their bodies decided it wasn't worth fighting anymore. In terms of design, the oubliette was a work of macabre ingenuity. Some castles incorporated additional features to maximize suffering. For example, certain oubliettes had walls lined with spikes or sharp edges, ensuring that any attempt to lean or climb resulted in cuts and wounds. In others, the pit was deliberately narrow, forcing prisoners to stand or crouch in an uncomfortable position, with no room to sit or lie down. At Corfe Castle in England, it said the Oubliette had a faulty drainage system that allowed rainwater to pool, turning the pit into a fetid pool where prisoners had to fight to avoid drowning. The Oubliette also had an impact on the guards, believe it or not. Though many were hardened men, accustomed to the violence of the era, there was something about the act of throwing a human into a pit and sealing the trapdoor that left a mark. Some stories suggest guards avoided approaching the Oubliette at night, convinced that the prisoners' wails were actually the screams of ghosts. In one Scottish castle, guards swore they could hear laughter coming from the pit, though no one could confirm if it was real or a product of their own guilt. Because, as hard as it is to believe, even in the Middle Ages, where cruelty was commonplace, the Oubliette was considered excessive by some. If we compare, the Oubliette makes other historical prisons look like spas. Take, for example, the Tower of London, famous for its high-profile prisoners. Yes, the Tower was a grim place, but high-ranking prisoners often had a cell with a window, some food, and, with luck, a trial before their heads were chopped off. In the Oubliette, there was no such courtesy. Or consider the galleys, where prisoners rode until they died. Brutal, no doubt, but at least you saw the sun and could curse the overseer out loud. The Oubliette offered no such small mercies. The inevitable question is, how could a society justify something like this? The answer lies in the mindset of the time. In the Middle Ages, punishment wasn't just about justice, it was about spectacle and control. The Oubliette, though hidden, was a tool of power. Feudal lords used it to project an image of absolute authority. Disobey, and you won't just die, you'll be erased. It was a form of psychological terrorism, designed to keep the population in line. And it worked. Stories about the Oubliette circulated as warnings, ensuring that even the most rebellious thought twice before defying the local lord. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the use of the Oubliette began to decline. Not because humanity suddenly became more compassionate, but because punishment methods evolved. Public executions, more organized prisons, and structured legal systems made the pits of oblivion seem outdated. Plus, maintaining an oubliette wasn't as practical as it seemed. Digging a pit into rock was costly, and castles began to be used more as residences than fortresses. Lords preferred to spend their money on tapestries and banquets rather than holes for prisoners. Yet, the legacy of the oubliette endures. In museums and castles that still preserve these dungeons, visitors can peer into the pits and feel a chill, though most can't imagine the true horror of being trapped there. Tour guides, with their enthusiasm for the macabre, often tell exaggerated stories about the prisoners, adding gory details for the delight of tourists. But the reality needs no embellishment. The oubliette was terrifying enough on its own. The oubliette also left its mark on literature and popular culture. In Gothic novels, for example, dark dungeons and deep pits became a recurring symbol of terror and oppression. Authors like Edgar Allan Poe, with his story, The Pit and the Pendulum, captured the essence of the oubliette, albeit with a touch of literary drama. In film, movies like The Count of Monte Cristo have portrayed similar dungeons, though often with a hero who escapes against all odds. In reality, escapes were rare, and happy endings even rarer. The oubliette also raises philosophical questions about the nature of punishment. What does it say about a society that not only punishes but erases its enemies? In the Middle Ages, the answer was clear. Power was absolute, and dissent could not be tolerated. But even in that context, the oubliette seems an extreme, a place where cruelty stripped away any pretense of justice. It was, in essence, a moral black hole, a place where the rules of humanity didn't apply. Looking beyond Europe, we find parallels in other cultures. In feudal Japan, for example, there were dungeons known as rokashakubu, cells so small that prisoners couldn't even stand upright. Though not identical to the oubliette, they shared the same philosophy of isolation and oblivion. In the Ottoman Empire, the underground prisons of Istanbul's palaces, like the infamous Yedikule fortress, had cells where prisoners were left to languish in similar conditions. The idea of burying the undesirable in a place where the world could forget them seems, sadly, universal. Back in Europe, it's worth noting that not all castles had an oubliette, but those that did used it with a clear purpose. At Dover Castle in England, the oubliette was known as the Pit of Oblivion, and it's said to have been used for prisoners of war during the Norman invasions. Chronicles claim prisoners were thrown into the pit so frequently that the castle had a dedicated team to dig new ones when the old ones filled up. This, of course, raises the question of how forgotten prisoners could be if they kept needing to make room. In France, the castle of Vincennes had an oubliette that was particularly feared. This castle, which served as a royal prison, housed high-profile prisoners, including nobles and royals who had fallen out of favor. Vincennes' oubliette was a deep pit with smooth stone walls and an iron-reinforced trapdoor. According to records, some prisoners were kept in the oubliette for years, surviving only because guards, out of whim or bribe, occasionally tossed them food. One such prisoner, a noble whose identity remains a mystery, left inscriptions on the pit's walls, scratched with a nail or a piece of bone. These inscriptions, discovered centuries later, were a mix of prayers, curses, and pleas, a heartbreaking testament to human desperation. The oubliette also influenced later prison architecture. Though the pits of oblivion fell out of use, the idea of isolating prisoners shaped the design of modern prisons, like the solitary confinement cells of the 19th century. However, even these cells, with their white walls and strict routines, seem humane compared to the oubliette. At least in a modern solitary cell, you have a bed, a light, and the hope of getting out someday. In the oubliette, there was none of that. The decline of the oubliette didn't mean the end of cruelty in prisons, of course. The jails of the Renaissance and Enlightenment brought their own horrors, from the overcrowded dungeons of the Bastille to penal colonies where prisoners were worked to death. But the oubliette remains unique in its brutal simplicity. It didn't need torturers or sophisticated instruments. The pit itself was the punishment, a suffering machine that operated without human intervention. Today, oubliettes are little more than historical curiosities, relics of an era we'd prefer to forget. Many have been sealed, turned into tourist attractions, or simply abandoned. But their legacy lives on in the stories we tell, the nightmares they evoke, and the questions they force us to ask about the nature of punishment and humanity. Because, in the end, the oubliette wasn't just a place, it was an idea that the worst fate isn't death, but being erased from the world.